Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Hybrid Ag webinar. So my name is Sarah Tinsley, and I'm a member of the Hybrid Ag Research and Support team. So I'm excited to open this Ripening webinar, which is the fifth part of a six-part series of events focused upon the stages of plant nutrient importance that we've scheduled for this year. So through this series of educational webinars, we'll take you on a graphic journey through the season, looking into some of the technical aspects and scientific facts about soil health and plant nutrition. Hybrid Ag are on a quest to transform food for health, and that's our purpose. So we're continuing to curate research from the last 150 years worth of soil and plant nutrition research and data during our journey to discover exactly what it is that makes food healthy and how we can better grow nutrient-dense food. And so I'll now introduce you to our panelists today. So today we have Joe Grace and Judah Rowe, and they're two of our research agronomists that work across a variety of horticultural crops. And so my name is Sarah Tinsley. I'm currently completing an honours year in soil science. I have a passion for making scientific information usable to everybody. So if you do have questions as we go along today, feel free to type them into the Q&A box that's just at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be able to answer those at the end. But so now, Joe, would you like to kick us off and tell us what we're going to be focusing on today?
Yeah, good morning. So as Sarah mentioned, we're talking about ripening stage of growth today. So during ripening, the fruit is at one of its most susceptible stages to damage, and also we have bud initiation taking place for next year's crop. So we must ensure that the tree has enough energy to ripen healthy fruit and reward us with long shelf life, and then also minimise the stress as much as possible on the tree, and provide as much energy as we can to the tree to promote strong bud development for next year's crop. So to try and help us get away from biannual bearing in some crops where we have this issue. So for today's presentation, we'll begin with some of the key physiological processes that are responsible for the fruit ripening, and then we'll move to the nutritional influences that we can have on these processes, with some particular nutrients to keep in mind for any applications during this stage. So Judah's going to introduce the process, starting off with some of the hormonal factors in ripening.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Sarah, for all you've done on this webinar. But just start off to fully understand ripening in the crop cycle and going closer to harvest, you have to understand changes in the plant hormone balance. We believe that plant hormone function can be regulated by mineral nutrition and the balance of mineral nutrition within the plant. The reason for this is due to the requirement of different nutrients as cofactors to maintain enzyme function within the plant. Enzyme function obviously then has a very, very large role to play on the plant hormones that are used in ripening. Ripening occurs obviously as fruit cells are maturing, and it's at this time that many hormonal changes begin to occur within the fruit. So some of those changes, things like colour can change, obviously, fruit can become softer, the texture changes, sugars accumulate and release within the fruit, and the flavour and the aromas are developed, and there's a reduction in organic acids. So it's all of these things that are changing and being maximised closer to harvest. And it's very, very important to understand how we can impact that. One of the ways that we can have the maximum impact on this is to increase or maximise cytokine production within the plant. This is due to the ability of this plant to regulate and stimulate nutrient interactions, and then even plant function within the root zone. And so it's important to use a stack of nutrient that can be built on one another in order to maximise cytokine production. And further to that, obviously one of the largest impacts on ripening is ethylene production, and that happens through a process called the Yang cycle. And the Yang cycle is the production of ethylene, or the ethylene biosynthesis. And this cycle functions in a much more balanced process when cytokine balance is the dominant hormone production. And as a gentleman from the States has told us, John Kemp, he says that he has yet to see a plant that suffers from an excess of cytokinins. So as we can maximise our cytokine production, we can have a really large impact on the ability of that plant to produce ethylene in a much more balanced manner. And so then we can have a look at all the other hormones that are involved in ripening. We've talked about auxins, we've talked about cytokinins, and we've talked about ethylene production. And these are all ones that were very, very, very common and that we all know about. There's a number of other hormones, things like abscisic acid, silicic acid, jasminates, gibberellins, which we all know a little bit about, but we don't really know their impact on ripening properly, treocontanol. There's a stack of others that are involved that have a meaningful impact on hormone production and the ripening process that we don't currently know about. So we've got a lot of learning to do. But what we do know is that all of these hormones require an enzyme process. So if we move on, we can have a look at the different kinds of fruits and the different kinds of hormones that are used in the ripening process and the maturity process of these different kinds of fruit. So we've got two kinds of fruits that we use in, or that we have in horticultural production today. And that's climacteric fruits and non-climacteric fruits. Climacteric fruits are those that are driven almost entirely by ethylene production, and they're the ones that can be ripened after harvest. So they can be picked green and then ripened. Things like apples, things like tomatoes, depending on where you're from, and bananas and those sort of things. But hormones, the hormone ethylene is the prominent driver in these fruits. And what happens is that as the fruit gets closer to maturity, elevated levels lead to this fruit becoming ripe. And different varieties, different production systems can experience a sharper increase in ethylene than others. And what we know now is that mineral balance can affect the rate of increase. So that as we get our mineral balance really, really right, we can actually change the rate of increase. We can slow down the rate of increase in ethylene. And this enables a number of things. It enables the regulation of sugars, and also things like it gives us a couple more days to size fruit and those sort of things. But once you can understand that, you can really get some rigor around your harvest dates and around the quality, ensuring that the best quality product arrives at the consumer. And then non-climacteric fruits, they don't have quite the same relationship with ethylene. Ethylene is still involved, but they're more ripening. The ripening in those fruits is more determined by sugar accumulation. And they don't have quite the same relationship with ethylene, but they have relationships with abscisic acid and other compounds such as the jasmonic acid that we've talked about, which we don't understand properly. But these crops include oranges, grapes, cherries, and they ripen on the tree. Some of those crops that we're looking at, so we look at something like cherries, we use colour as one of the key influences to determine maturity. In grapes, we look at baumé. In apples, we can look at starch and colour. And in things like stone fruits and other crops, we look at the Brix level. And the ability to manipulate some of these final stages depend 100% on the crop that we're dealing with. If you want more information on how individual crops function coming into harvest and the different hormone production and functions that are used, feel free to get in touch about your individual crop. I'll just pass back over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about sugar production within the plant.
All right, thanks for that, Judah. So we'll talk a little bit about sugar production and how the sugars are moving through the plant. So I can see as well just that we've got some interesting questions coming in. So just a reminder to keep sending those in using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you would like more explanation on any of the topics that we're going over today. So sugars that are moved around during ripening are created during photosynthesis. So photosynthesis begins as water is brought up through the roots of the plant, and it's combined with carbon dioxide and light that's been taken in through the leaves. So using the energy of the sunlight, water and carbon dioxide are transformed into sugars that are used by the plant and an oxygen gas that's released back out into the air. So using this example, we can imagine the leaves as solar panels that provide the plant with energy to run. So now I'll pass back to Judah to talk about sugar storage and how these sugars move through the plant.
Thanks, Sarah. So obviously photosynthesis, we're looking at converting sunlight into energies and sugars. The plant then stores those sugars as glucose, carbohydrates, and within and around starch formations of the plant. And these are generally, these are stored both in insoluble and soluble forms in the plant. But the one starch that I just want to talk about briefly is amylose. And that's an insoluble starch, but it's a smaller molecule, and that allows it to be used as the main storage and release of glucose to plants. And what we know is that as it's through precise nutrient balance through the cell enlargement phase of the crop, that we can have the most impact on sugar, starch, and carbohydrate accumulation within the fruit. But as the plant begins to ripen, that starch breaks down and releases the glucose. And this is what creates some of the sweetening of the fruit and begins ethylene production. It begins the organic acid accumulation within the fruit. And this is where we get the changes in the actual texture in the fruit flesh. So it's the hormone balance here, and most critically, I'll go back again to the cytokine balance that really helps us regulate how quickly and how well this process happens. So too little sugar, not enough starch breakdown, not enough glucose release, and the fruit lacks taste. We see this when we have a rain event, and we don't get that breakdown of glucose through the presence of the water, and the fruit then lacks taste. The fruit will have a reduced shelf life, cell wall weakens, all those things. The flip side of that is that we get ethylene production increases very quickly. We get starch breakdown happens unevenly across the piece of fruit. And then we get things like sugar spot. That's where the sugar accumulates in a much higher concentration in one part of the fruit, and we get cell collapse and sugar accumulation. So these are some of the things that we can control by understanding nutrient balance. And then so I'll just show this slide just on starch, iodine starch plating in apples, because it's one example of showing how starch breaks down and releases glucose. A lot of this process will be common to a lot of people, especially in pome fruit, as pome fruit growers, but it begins to show how the starch releases glucose. And this is really, really important. And these are some of the things that we can have a real impact on through mineral balance. I'll now pass back to Joe to finish this off, bring us home with some of the other points.
Okay, so as the fruit gets closer to maturity, we begin to have colour development in fruit. So this involves the production of coloured pigments, which can range across a number of colours, such as yellow or gold, which we see in bananas and lemons. We have orange and red pigments like those seen in oranges and apples and cherries, and also some purple pigments, and blue, like some of those seen in grapes and plums, for example. So mostly we can break these into three areas. Most immature fruit contains chlorophylls, which are green pigments responsible for photosynthesis, which we're familiar with because obviously they're quite present in the leaf. These are located within a part of the cell, which we've just got there on the slide, a diagram of a cell. These are located in that part of the cell known as the chloroplast. Another compound, or another range of compounds that we have are carotenoids, which are responsible for the yellow and orange and also sometimes red colours, and these are located in the chromoplast part of the cell. We also have anthocyanins, which are red, sometimes blue, sometimes purple, depending on the environment that they're in and crop type that they're in. And these are located in the vacuole part of the cell. So I'll use apples as an example. So as apples mature, we have chlorophyll present in the fruit to begin with, and then it degrades as carotenoid production increases. At the same time, we have anthocyanin production beginning, which may increase its concentration in the vacuole up to 5 times concentration in the cell. So anthocyanins obviously being that the one that is responsible for that bright red colour in red apples. Different genetics determine the amount of potential anthocyanin concentration that we can produce. So for example, the difference between the colours, one of the main differences between the colours produced in Red Delicious and, for example, Granny Smith is the anthocyanin concentration. So Red Delicious produce a very, very high, will have a very, very high total potential concentration that they can produce. Granny Smith produces a very, very small amount and tend to produce more carotenoids, which is why we see Granny Smith and Golden Delicious go to more of a yellow colour when they're over mature, because they are producing more of those carotenoids, which tend to have that more yellowy colour. So an interesting note about anthocyanins is actually that they are water soluble. So fruit that is coloured with anthocyanins, when cooked, will generally become bleached because the colour disperses in water. In contrast, the red pigments on peppers and tomatoes, for example, are produced by carotenoids and remain red when they're cooked because they're non-water soluble. So throughout the process of these, throughout these processes of the colouring, the plant makes use of a lot of enzymes. So a lot of these enzymes are used to accelerate and or sometimes enable the procedure. And there are a lot of enzymes that use what are called cofactors or a catalyst, which sometimes can be synthesized by the plant or sometimes can be just a metal element, which enables that enzyme to function. Where this relates to nutrition is a lot of these are micro trace elements such as iodine, nickel, selenium, all the fun ones that we don't often talk about. So a lot of kelps and seed-derived products can contain traces of these nutrients, which is why sometimes we see increased colour in fruit when adding these to foliar applications close to harvest. So they're required in very, very small amounts, so that not many, we don't often do applications of them as an input unless we're looking at a particular issue. But they're deficient in a lot of Australian soils and can have quite an impact on some of these important processes that are taking place in the plant during this colouring process. So finally, we'll just go over some of the nutrient requirements for plant ripening and some of the effects that different nutrients can have on this stage. So, as we mentioned earlier, it's important to note that ripening occurs alongside bud initiation. So there'll be, as we mentioned last week, there'll be some crossover in nutrient requirements during this period. So we have sulfur, magnesium, and molybdenum, which are our nitrogen conversion elements required for nitrogen conversion in the plant. So we need nitrate and ammonium being converted to proteins and amino acids in the plant. And also, particularly during ripening, we want to keep the nitrogen as low as possible in the plant to avoid soft fruits. We've got iron, manganese, phosphorus, magnesium and calcium groups there. These are required to help that cytokine balance, which we talked about earlier, which helps to regulate the ripening process. So not necessarily slow it down, but having that cytokine balance or dominance in the plant allows us to have a more even and consistent ripening within a variety or on a tree. These nutrients are also required for photosynthesis, and important to note that nitrogen conversion, for it to function, we need to have photosynthesis happening at this stage. Also, a lot of plants during this ripening stage, it can be during that hottest time of the year. So if we're coming to sort of December, January, a lot of fruit is ripening and it's a high period of heat stress on the tree. And we need to ensure that we have that photosynthetic cycle continuing so that we're getting efficient use of the water that's going through the tree. And then also we're not impacting on next year's crop because the bud development is going on. And if we don't have enough energy in the tree or in the plant at that time, we can end up, it can influence or impact biennial bearing in some crops. So we then got some also phosphorus I just mentioned, which is obviously pretty important for ATP production and the photosynthetic cycle, which we've mentioned before. But during ripening, it's required for some of the enzymatic functions which take place. And this is where in some cases, some growers have noticed a phosphorus application close to harvest can increase the colour in their fruit. This only occurs if you have a deficiency in phosphorus. If you have a deficiency in phosphorus, yes, very small amounts of potassium phosphate, doesn't have to be much at all, can greatly enhance the colour of the fruit and the intensity of the colour. So we then have boron and cobalt. Boron's quite important for the sugar movement into the fruit. And then cobalt is listed here because there's a bit of ongoing research into cobalt and ripening, and what we're noticing is plants with sufficient cobalt tend to have that more even ripening on the plant, on the tree, rather than a split ripening. And then whereas we're seeing cobalt deficiency could be linked to a split ripening in the tree. So that's just an interesting one to note, which is still a lot of research I'm going into. It is known that it is able to inhibit the production of ethylene, so it can slow ripening in some cases. So we'll go to the take homes for today. We've got our mineral balance, and one of the major ones here is nitrogen, potassium, and calcium for our colouring. We need to make sure that these are in balance. We know that we don't want too much nitrogen, but if we have a deficiency of nitrogen, nitrogen will actually increase colour. The same goes for potassium. We don't want an excess of potassium at this stage, but if we have a deficiency, it will increase colour. So the balance here is important through the whole season, but really during this ripening and colour stage, having that balance correct is what gives us the key to having the best colour that we can get in the fruit. Obviously, we have enzyme cofactors for some of the hormone production and some of the synthesis of some of their compounds for our anthocyanins and other amino acids. We want to have cytokine dominance. So again, similar to what we had in the flowering and bud development stage of the crop, we want to have cytokine dominance here. Understanding the impacts also of mineral balance on sugar and starch to enable, or just to, as far as what nutrients influence that sugar and starch moving into the fruit as the fruit ripens. So obviously, as I mentioned, excesses are probably, you could say, almost more detrimental than deficiencies at this stage of the crop. But if we have deficiencies, addressing them will increase they'll improve the outcome that we're looking for. For example, it's common to apply large amounts of potassium during the fruit fill stage of the crop, which is fine and required by most of the crops that we're growing. As long as we need to make sure the plant is utilising that when we're applying it. So if the plant has enough and we continue to supply large amounts just based on what we think the plant might need, inevitably we're going to impact calcium and magnesium levels in the sap, and that's going to negatively impact on our fruit quality and storage life. So just need to make sure that every application that we're doing throughout the whole season is for a reason. So fruit, like fungicides and insecticides, nutritional applications should always have a clear reason for why we're applying them, and then the desired outcome that we want to achieve from that application. So I think that's it from me. I'll hand back to you, Sarah.
Great, thanks for that, Joe. So thank you again to everybody for joining us in our webinar this morning. So in our next webinar, we're going to be following on from today's discussion, covering the stage of post-harvest, and this will happen sometime in January. So we'll release a date for that soon. So keep an eye on our social media for that detail. Additionally, this webinar is going to be uploaded to YouTube as well, as the same as our other webinars. So if you would like to review this content again, we'll send you a link to the video when it's uploaded. And if you have any feedback from this webinar to help us improve, then we'd love to hear from you. So please contact us at either support@hybridag.com.au or give us a ring on 5722 7555. So now we've had quite a few questions during this webinar, which we will cover in a document that will be emailed out to everybody. But for now, due to